Hi everyone, this is Nya and today I'm going to be making a set of these mini Christmas cards. If you want, you can double the size so you can open it up and write messages inside, or you can also write it behind the cards for the specific design. Since this is a set, I want the colors to be cohesive with each other, so I'm going to go through them now before starting the sketch and the painting. So here are the colors that I'm going to be using. Firstly, this is Burnt Umber by Holbein, Yellow Ochre by Holbein, Hooker's Green by Cotman, Cobalt Blue by Holbein, Buff Titanium by Daniel Smith, Winsor Red by Winsor & Newton, Mineral Violet by Holbein, and Hansa Yellow Medium by Daniel Smith. For the greeting on the card, I'm going to be using my Uni Pen Fine Line in 05. This one's optional, but I'm going to glaze a little bit of gold shimmer to one of the cards using this Finetech gold palette. This is also optional, but I'm going to be using my masking fluid for one of the designs. It's not completely necessary, but it just makes the painting process easier. For the first design, I'm going to be painting this present wrapped in a rustic way. And since the present is the main focal point, I'm going to draw it out first, and I'm trying to center it as best as I can, so I'm drawing out really loosely and lightly with my pencil. It's a little bit difficult to get it right at the center since it is on an angle, but I chose to draw it this way because I find that this shows more of the dimension. In terms of the decoration, after the bow, I tried to place pine leaves and berries in a natural way. I decided to only add the leaves on one side diagonally, which makes the composition less stiff. And to continue with the diagonal composition, I'm going to also add a small tag on the bottom right. Again, I'm just placing down the elements quickly to see how the composition works with each other, and I can make quick changes along the way. I'm not cleaning out too much of my lines since I'm going to still be moving them around. As an example, here I felt like the composition would look very empty with only the present in the middle, so I decided to add some decorative elements to frame the present. I'm adding more leaves and berries like what's on the present, and I'm just drawing them and moving them around until I find the position that I feel would work best with the composition. I ended up placing the corner frame on the top left and bottom right to support the diagonal line of the decorations, and also because those areas are a bit more empty. Once I'm happy with all the elements that I've included, including more or less the positioning of these items, I'm going to start cleaning out the lines. As you can see, I just erased the scratchy pencil marks, but you can still see a little bit of them, so I can follow it up with a cleaner line on top, and I'm going to do this for all of the elements. This time I'm also a bit more careful with the positioning of the berries, and as for the leaves, I just ended up erasing most of the lines with only some noticeable ones so I can paint freehand on top of it. Since I'm quite happy with the outline, I'm going to start to paint. For the base color of the present, I'm just using a medium consistency of buff titanium, which I'm going to paint all over while leaving out negative spaces for the berries and the tag. As for the side faces of the present, I'm going to use a slightly thicker consistency to separate the other sides, creating more of a three-dimensional form. To separate those sides further, I'm going to add a bit of Cobalt Blue and Burnt Umber into the Buff Titanium, and I'm just going to use a very light consistency to line the edges. Then, using what's left on my brush, I'm going to brush it all over. Again, this is a very light consistency, and I just dampen my brush further. Then, while the surface is still a little bit damp but more or less dry, I use a slightly thicker consistency to add the folds on one side. I also decided to use this tone to outline some of the edges just to make them look a bit cleaner. Next, I'm going to paint the berries. I used Winsor Red as the main color, then I added Hansa Yellow to warm up the color and also a bit of Burnt Umber to mute it down. As I'm painting, I also left out a bit of negative space for the highlights to make it shiny. Next, for the leaves, I used Hooker's Green as the dominant color, then I added Yellow Ochre as well as Burnt Umber to mute and warm the color. While I wait for the leaf to dry, I'm going to move on to paint the tag, and for this I use some mix of burnt umber and yellow ochre. The leaves look fairly dry after this, so I'm going to move back to paint the decorations. I just added more hooker's green into the previous leaf mixture to make it a little bit darker and a bit richer. Then I use a light load on my brush, using the tip of my brush to create those pointy edges for the pine leaves. To lighten the brush load, you can use tissue to dab off the excess paint, and this is very important for you to do before you paint really thin areas or small areas. This way the paint won't travel too fast out of your bristles, creating a puddly mess. After that, I went back in with a slightly thicker consistency of the same mixture, painting in between the leaves that I previously painted before. This is just to separate those two leaf types. Next, I switched to my small brush and I use a mix of burnt umber with a bit of cobalt blue to create this dark brown. And I'm going to use this to paint the bow and the string tie. For the left side of the bow, as you can see, I didn't paint the whole line. In fact, I put some of them behind the leaves to make it look like it's interacting with each other. With a really light load of the same color on my brush, I just painted some squiggles on the tag. This is just to represent a bit of writing, and I also outlined the edges to make it look cleaner. Then I went back in using the greens that I already had on my palette to paint on more leaves. Then here, as for the shadows underneath the tag, the berries and the decoration, I used a mix of buff titanium with a bit of cobalt blue. I'm also going to add a darker value red to the berries to give it a bit more form. And for this, I used the previous red with added burnt umber and mineral violet. Next, I'm going to paint the decorative elements. The first thing I'm going to paint are the bows of those plants, and for the color I just added more burnt umber into the previous red with a little bit of cobalt blue. Next, I'm going to paint the berries. I just used the dark red that I previously mixed before, and I'm also using my smaller brush because I want to make these berries smaller than the ones on the present. But while painting it, I also left out a bit of white negative space for the highlights. For the leaves, I want the color to be light and icy, so I used a mix of buff titanium with cobalt blue with a bit of the muted green that I used earlier. And while I'm painting the leaves, I also left out a bit of space in between those individual leaves. This way you give a bit of space for the stems, and this also makes the leaves a bit more delicate. Moving on to the pine leaves now. After the previous leaf is completely dry, I use the dark green mix from earlier, and I like to play around with the consistency, so some parts are a little bit lighter and some leaves are a bit darker. Just to remind you guys of the color, it's basically hooker's green with a bit of burnt umber and yellow ochre. Whenever I'm painting pine leaves, I like to use a really light load on my brush so the paint doesn't travel too fast out of the bristles, and this helps a lot with creating those thin lines. As for the stems, I just used the dark brown that I already had on my palette. I extended the stems below the plants, and I'm also going to paint the stems in between the leaves as well, using a slightly lighter consistency in between the leaves so it's not too glaring. Since the color of the smaller berries are a bit faded, I ended up just going over them again using a slightly thicker consistency of Winsor Red and burnt umber. Once I'm done, I'm going to write Merry Christmas. You can also write other things as well. You can also use things like calligraphy pens for extra personality to these cards, or any pens you have on hand. After the writing, I'm just going to finish everything off by erasing the extra scratchy pencil marks. And this is the finished look for the first design. Now let's move on to the second one, where I'll be painting this sparkly and shimmery bubble. Just like the previous card design, since the bubble is going to be the focal point or the main element of this painting, I tried to figure out the center point, which I just drew a line. And as I get around 1/3 of the paper, I started designing the hanger and also the bubble itself. I'm going to keep it simple and just draw a circle. At first I tried to freehand it, but then I realized why not just use an item that's close to the size. I used my washi tape, and since I want it to be slightly bigger, at least I have a guideline to follow, and I just expanded the size slightly following the roundness from the washi tape. Since the string is usually a loop, I ended up doing a V line instead of just one single string. And then I'm also going to start adding some decorations on top of the bauble. I personally really like the rustic feel of this, but it's also to make it cohesive with the other designs as well. But if you have any other ideas for your bubbles, you can of course customize it to your liking. For the design, I'm just going to keep things simple with leaves and dots. I'm personally comfortable drawing and painting these, which makes it much easier to follow the curvature or the cross contour of the bauble. I'm not just drawing them flatly, instead I want the design to help give the round form and volume of the bauble. For some additional decorative elements, I'm also going to add some stars for a sparkle effect and also some dots later on. Then I'm of course going to write Merry Christmas in the same way. Once I'm done, I'm going to prep the drawing, which means I'm just going to clean out the lines and make them a bit lighter so those scratchiness won't show through the paint. Now let's start to paint. I'm going to use the same color for the base of the bauble. Just like the present, I use a thin consistency of buff titanium, and I'm just going to cover the whole surface, even over the leaves. Once I'm done, while the surface is still a bit damp, I added a bit more paint at the bottom, and here I'm just trying to slowly build the round form to help it look more three-dimensional. As I get closer to the edges, I use a thicker consistency and I just try to spread them out while creating a softer transition. And since buff titanium is quite light, I'm going to help it with another color, so I added a bit of burnt umber. This time I'm using a thinner consistency because burnt umber is quite dark in value compared to buff titanium. And of course I want to make sure that the transition is nice and smooth, so I just use my brush to pull the colors around to create a softer transition. I'm going to move on to the berries while I wait for the base color of the bubble to dry, and for this I use a mix of Winsor Red with Mineral Violet, and just like before I painted it while leaving a bit of white negative space to give a bit of highlights and make the berries look shiny. To add additional shadows and make this pop a bit more, I decided to add a bit of burnt umber into the previous mixture to create a slightly darker red, and I'm just lining the bottom section. For the green this time, I'm using a mix of Hooker's green with Mineral Violet and Yellow Ochre, and for the smaller ones I use a slightly thicker consistency, and then I use a slightly lighter consistency for the larger leaves. And for a bit of variation, I decided to add a bit more Yellow Ochre in the ratio for a lighter, more yellowish green as well. Just like how I painted the leaves before, I'm leaving out a bit of space in between them so they're not touching each other, and this is for the stems later. For the pine leaves, I'm starting with a mix of Hooker's green and burnt umber. I first use a mixture with a bit more burnt umber in the ratio to paint on the stems just to indicate the placing first. Then I use a bit more Hooker's green for a cooler green, and of course I use a light brush load to paint the individual leaves. You can also switch to a smaller brush to control the flow of your paint better. I like to also paint in between the lighter leaves that I painted earlier, and for those areas I tend to use a slightly darker tone to separate the two values, and this will also make the lighter leaves pop out a little bit more instead of it blending with the color of the pine leaves. For the bubble holder, I'm going to use a golden color from a mix of burnt umber and yellow ochre. Then to mute down the color, I added a touch of cobalt blue. To create a metallic effect, I decided to add more cobalt blue into the ratio, and this will just create a darker brown, which I paint on the sides, leaving the center lighter, and this will give more of a metallic shine. And at the bottom here, I use a mix of yellow ochre and burnt umber, followed up with a darker brown to line some of the edges, giving the edges a bit more definition and also a bit of shadow. By now, the base color of the bubble should be dry, and here I'm using a thin consistency of the buff titanium and burnt umber mix again, and I'm just painting it very thinly, then using a clean damp brush to soften the edges, helping bring the darker values inwards, creating more of an orb form. Then for the leaf pattern, I just use a mix of yellow ochre and burnt umber to create this golden tone. Once I've painted all of the leaves, I'm going to paint the stem. For this, I switched to my smaller brush, and I also added a bit of cobalt blue into the previous brown color. I'm also going to layer a little bit of this darker brown in a light consistency for some of the leaves which are near the edges of the bubble, and this will just enhance the form a bit more. As for the dots, I just use a mix of yellow ochre and burnt umber again. While I still have the brown mixtures on my palette, I also decided to use it to paint the stems for the berries. Next, I'm going to be painting the stars, and for this I'm using a mix of Hansa yellow with a touch of the previous browns from yellow ochre and burnt umber, and I'm just outlining it using a very thick consistency. I want to soften the inside of the outline, so here I'm just using a clean damp brush to smudge the center. As for the dots, I used Hansa yellow by itself, and I also used a slightly lighter consistency. Now, this is the optional part, but I'm going to go over the gold leaves that I've painted using my Finetech gold, and this will just add a bit of shimmer when you're looking at it from a certain angle. After that, I'm pretty much done with the painting, so I'm going to write the greeting with my brown pen again. To finish everything off, I'm just going to erase the extra pencil marks. And that's it for the second design with a touch of gold shimmer. Let's move on to the third design, where I'll be painting a Christmas tree in a basket. I'm going to start by painting the tip of the tree straight away, since this part should be at the center vertically. Then I just drew thin lines on either side to position the triangular silhouette of the tree. After that, I'm going to fill in the edges with some leaves just to indicate some of the positioning which are a bit further out and which one's a bit inward. After that, I just drew on the basket. You can also draw different types of baskets if you want to customize your painting. Next, I'm going to allocate the positioning of the Christmas tree decorations. I'm adding lights in the middle. As you can see, I've placed the strings diagonally and added small circles. Then along the sides, I also decided to add some bubbles. On the bottom left, I decided to add extra decorations, like more of the leaves and berries and things like that. And at the bottom of the tree on the right hand side, I also included some presents as well, with a star on top of the tree. And since there's already a lot of things going on, I'm just going to finish off the design with the writing Merry Christmas at the bottom. Once I'm done with the sketch, I'm going to clean out the outline. I took most of the pencil sketch in the middle of the tree off so I can mask the area for the lights and also the bubbles using my masking fluid. After masking off the lights and bubbles, make sure to leave it to completely dry. I personally sketched out all the designs at the beginning before I painted this one by one, so I actually had time to wait for this to dry while I painted the other two designs. But anyway, with the power of editing, everything is completely dry, so let's get to painting. For the main color of the tree, I used a mix of Hooker's Green, Cobalt Blue, and Yellow Ochre. And I'm using a medium consistency with a light brush load like usual in order to get the little details. And I'm painting the outer part of the tree first because I want to make sure that the edges are nice and textured. When I started to get close to the bottom of the tree, that's when I started to add some of the leaf textured in the middle of the tree as well. And this is just to remind myself that even in the middle of the tree or the front of the tree, there are some leaves which are facing upwards and downwards as well to create more of a natural placement. And while doing this, I want to make sure I'm touching the edges of the mask areas for the baubles. This way, when I take off the masking fluid later, I can see the clean edges of where I should place the baubles. In terms of the light though, I want to avoid painting the green on that area because I'm going to create the glow here. I used a mix of Hansa yellow with a bit of Winsor red to create an orange color, and then I used a light consistency to just paint it all around the area of the light that I've masked. Then I'm going to follow this up by adding some of the greens from the leaves, while the surface of the yellow glow is still a little bit damp, so the colors can mingle with each other naturally. As I'm painting towards the inner portion of the tree, you'll see me smudging my paint more in a light consistency, so the lines of the pine leaves are not as prominent as the edges. This is so the leaves doesn't become too distracting with too much detail, and the leaves that we've painted are already enough for our eyes to adjust to anyway, and it's enough to suggest the texture of the tree. Even if we end up smudging some of the details off, we can always add it on later, which is what I'm doing here, using a slightly thicker consistency as well. And I'm also using a lighter consistency for the base so it doesn't look too bulky and heavy. This is also why I've left out a lot of negative space in between. It's basically for the same effect. Then after that, you'll see me dotting things around. This is just for extra texture and decoration. I use the mix of mineral violet with the red. For the star, you can use any color that you want. You can even use the gold for a bit of sparkle, but as for me, I just used Hansa yellow with a little bit of red to deepen the yellow slightly. So that's it for the tree for now, and I'm going to move on to the leaves beside the basket. For this, I ended up using the light green mixture from buff titanium and cobalt blue mixed with the muted green of the pine leaves. And I also used a slightly lighter green for extra pine leaf texture. I'm also going to freehand some extra branches around for a bit more texture, and for this I used burnt umber with a bit of cobalt blue. As for the presents, I'm just going to keep it simple. I basically just use buff titanium, but I paint each section using a slightly different consistency to separate those two presents. Let's move on to the basket. For this, I'm using a mix of yellow ochre and burnt umber, and I also left out a section at first because I wasn't sure about the design. For the base color though, I'm just using a thin consistency of that color, but I like to vary the consistency slightly and also add texture along the way to create an uneven surface. For the textures, I added a bit more burnt umber and cobalt blue hue into the mixture to create a darker brown. In terms of application, I kind of flatten my brush and sort of tap it to create uneven dashed lines. And after the surface is completely dry, I also went back in, creating the same types of texture using more burnt umber in a slightly thicker consistency. Here I'm going to separate the two presents. I first used a thick consistency of buff titanium, and then I softened the blend. And as for the detail of the bow and the string, I used my pen. I also decided to add a bit more shadow using the browns from the basket, and I just added this to the bottom and also to the present behind. For the space directly underneath the tree, I'm going to use a really thick consistency of the dark green from the pine leaves, and I'm just going to add shadows, which I'm also going to add in between the layers of the leaves as well. Then while I wait for everything to dry, I'm going to write Merry Christmas. Once everything is completely dry, I'm going to take off the masking fluid to reveal the small lights that you've painted with the glow. And and I'm also going to paint on the bubbles. For the bubbles, I decided to use the berry mixture, which is from Winsor Red and Mineral Violet. And just like before, I'm also going to leave out the white negative space for the highlights. But if you would like to introduce different colors or you want a different theme, you can also do that to customize your painting. Then to increase the glow of the lights, I decided to use the yellow from the star to just outline the glow again. And I'm just using a medium to thin consistency here so it doesn't overpower the rest of the painting. For some finishing touches, I thought that the edges looked a little bit rough, so I decided to use the thinner consistency of the exact same green to just add some looser branches or some looser leaves as well. Then I also added more shadows on the basket to make it look more three-dimensional, especially around the sides. I also felt like there were too many leaves, so I just painted over some of the leaves in front of the basket. I also felt like the lights and the bubbles were getting lost since there were too many details for the tree, so here I'm going back in with a damp brush to just soften some of the edges. A little bit more of the softer leaves on the side of the tree, and that's pretty much it for the third and final design. So here's a final look at the set together. If you guys enjoyed this video and would like to see more content like this, please consider subscribing. I'll also link more Christmas themed paintings playlists at the end of this video. But like usual, all the list of tools as well as my social media links will be in my description box. If you guys are still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Bye!